When I'm in the pits working for ESPN, I have a lot of things. You know, people hear voices in their head. I'm one of them. I have the program audio of the broadcast. I have a director in my ear. I've got a producer in my ear, and I listen to the team radios. So the great thing is I get a front row seat to everything that's going on. After this problem, they sent him back out, and as you might imagine, Alexander Rossi was frustrated. But I can tell you, Brian Herta did a phenomenal job of coaching him through it, saying, hey, don't worry about it, relax, we'll gain it back. So they sent him back out, and everything actually went fairly smoothly. He was running quickly. As I said, he set the fastest lap of the race that day. And then he came in for his next pit stop. Now, remember last time there was a problem with the fuel hose, and it took 3 extra seconds. They didn't fix the problem. And this pit stop took 19 seconds. That is an eternity. Now, once again, you're thinking, okay, 10 seconds. But think about this. It takes 40 seconds to do an entire lap of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. If you lose 10 seconds in the pits, you've just lost a quarter of a lap. A quarter of a lap because of a mistake in the pit stop. Now, this brings up another really important point. They had a problem in that one pit stop, and then they had a problem in the second pit stop. Now, it's easy at this point to start pointing fingers and blame and talk about that, but they had to communicate after the setback. They had to get together and they had to fix the problem. Now, I realize, once again, this is a very heated environment where you've got 3 hours during the course of this race. Things have to happen very quickly, but I would argue in a hospital setting, sometimes you have the exact same situation where, you know, in an emergency room, you've got things going on quickly, or anywhere around the hospital, things can happen very quickly. But the point being, what they had to do, and I heard Brian Herta that day talking on the radio saying, don't worry about what we've lost, let's worry about how we fix the problem. And I will tell you, they figured out what the problem was. It was a problem with the specific fuel hose, the nozzle at the very end. They had a spare, that's important. They had planned ahead because of the communications culture. They had a spare, they brought it out. But then the other thing that had to happen was Brian Herta had a rookie on the track. And at this point, Alexander Rossi is incredibly frustrated. He's just gone from, thinking he was at least a contender. When he went back out on the track after that pit stop, he was literally in last place. Last place. And he's frustrated. You could hear his frustration on the radio. And Brian Herta sat there and talked to him and said, don't worry about it. We'll come up with a new plan. We'll figure out a different way to achieve our goal. Relax. Meanwhile, he's talking to the crew, telling them, okay, we need to solve this problem. Make sure it doesn't happen again. The point being, the guy at the top, the guy he was listening and he was leading this group through this problem. At some point, somebody has to be able to do that. The other thing Brian Herta at this point had to do was figure out a new strategy. Because going fast and being out front wasn't going to work when you were in last place, right? So he began to come up with a different idea. What's a different way we can approach this? And really, this is what we do in every organization every day. You can't always, once again, spend the most money. You can't always just have the best people at the right moment at the right time. You have to come up with new ways. You have to strategize. So they collaborated. They sat and they talked, and they decided maybe if we can't win on pure speed, we could win by getting the best fuel mileage. Now, I know what you're thinking. How could you possibly win a race by having better fuel mileage? But think about this. If you get better fuel mileage, it's possible to run the race and have one less pit stop. One less pit stop. Now, how significant is that? I mean, a pit stop only takes 9 seconds, right? Except that it takes about 40 seconds to complete a pit stop because you have to slow down, drive onto pit lane, go about 60 miles an hour, come in, 9 seconds of the pit, slow up, go 60 miles an hour. So 40 seconds is what it takes out of a race. How long is a lap of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway? 40 seconds. If you can eliminate one pit stop, you can, in essence, gain one lap on the entire field. So they began playing with the concept of, okay, what would it take for us to get better mileage? The group got together and they talked on their stand and they came up with the concept of, okay, maybe we'll get a little better mileage. Now, and I want to point out this picture. This is what they call a pit stand. The team members, and there'll be about 6 to 8 of them, will be sitting on this team stand. And I will tell you, it is a very close environment. And you might argue it's easy for these people to collaborate when they can literally see one another. Except that there's so much going on in their world, frankly, it is hard. They're looking at their computer screens because they get telemetry, which is the actual information coming from the car to the track, to the pit. So they know what the engine temperature is. They know what the tire pressures are. They know how much fuel, they know everything about that car. And sometimes with everything swirling around them, it is hard for them to communicate. But Brian Herta had to force them that day to say, okay, we need to come up with a new plan. What's the best fuel fuel mileage you think we can get? And they came up with a number, and they began to feed that to Alexander Rossi. Now, how many people have one of those new cars that tells you your fuel mileage when you're driving to work every day, right? A lot of people have those. So what if I told you, maybe you got 25 miles to the gallon on the way to work. What if I told you, tomorrow I want you to get 35 miles a gallon? Now, 35, not outrageous. You just have to kind of, maybe mind the way you're doing things, coast through lights, all those kind of. They began to give Alexander Rossi that kind of information. They began to tell him, you just need to do this, and maybe try this, and you do this thing called drafting, where you come up behind a car, let them break through the air, and it helps you just a little bit. So they began to experiment as time went along. And actually, they were figuring out that they could do this. The significant thing was, though, that they were collaborating, they were communicating, they were talking about how they were going to pull this off. Another thing they were doing is they were talking out loud. They were strategizing out loud. They weren't, I always point out, they weren't sending emails. They weren't sending text messages. They were talking to one another. Now, once again, when you look at that pit stand and they're all really close together, you would think, well, how could they not? But there is so much going around, sometimes it is hard to get somebody's eyes and their attention and say, let's talk about this. But I listened to them. They were strategizing out loud, trying to come up with new ways that they were going to pull this off. What was it going to take? What was the best fuel mileage they could possibly get? All right, we're going to move forward, because I will tell you, Alexander Rossi did a great job that day. First, they fed him one fuel number that he needed to do, a mileage number. He did that. Then they fed him another one a little bit higher, and he was able to do that. And he did a great job. And as I said, he was going pretty quickly that day until he had to start saving fuel. And then along comes lap 164. Now, I will tell you that most cars at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway will do about 30 laps in between pit stops. They'll come in, they'll get 4 tires, a full load of fuel, which in this case is actually ethanol. They don't use regular gasoline. They put ethanol in the car, and then they'll send them back out. And so at lap 164, there's an incident on the track, and it brings out what's called a yellow flag. In this case, it's called a full course caution. And in racing, what happens is maybe somebody tapped the wall, sometimes an engine blows, whatever it may be, but they decide they need to bring a safety truck out onto the track. And when they do that, they bring out a yellow flag and they slow everybody down. And they say, we're not going to run at full speed because it's just too dangerous. And this is the perfect time to do a pit stop, because instead of losing 40 seconds because everybody goes 220 miles an hour, now they're only going 60, 80 miles an hour. It's a lot easier. So at lap 164, yellow flag comes out, and all of the cars, and I mean all of the cars, come in and make a pit stop. And all of the cars, of course, includes Alexander Rossi. You can slightly see him. He's the yellow and blue car right there. The good news is, remember all the problems they had with the pit stops? Those were all gone. Because they had communicated, they'd figured out what the problem was, not worried about the blame of how it happened, but figured out how to move it forward. They were able to effectively get him in and get him out every pit stop after that. And they send him back out. There's just one problem. If you come in at lap 164, that means you have 36 laps remaining in the race, which means you're not going to be able to finish the race without one more pit stop. Unless, of course, all day long you had been thinking about ways to save fuel and to get better fuel mileage. And that's exactly what they had been doing. So from the moment they made this last pit stop, they told Alexander Rossi, we're going into massive fuel saving mode. Now remember I told you about being 35 miles to the gallon? They now told Rossi the equivalent of, you have to get 50 miles to the gallon. And I can tell you, I was listening to Alexander Rossi that day in my headset, and the first thing he said was, there is no way. And Brian kept coaching him, saying, listen to me, we think we can do it, here's how you're going to do it. And he gave him advice. He told him how to clutch, what's called clutch and coast. Pop in the clutch for just a moment, coast a little bit, but by the way, don't go slow. So think about this. Not only do you have to get 50 miles to the gallon, but you've got to get to work on time, and your boss left the same time as you. That's the situation you're in. There was so much frustration in his voice early on, but they kept coaching. He kept saying, this is what the team's done, we figured out this, and more importantly, they gave him information. It wasn't just enough to say, you need to get 50 miles to the gallon. And in this case, I'll tell you, to be honest with you, the actual number is 4.7 miles to the gallon. They burn fuel pretty quick. But it wasn't enough to say, this is the number. It was the way they coached him. They gave him the information saying, we know we can do this, and this is why. They had to communicate how they were going to accomplish this task. It wasn't enough just to throw the number out there. And that's really critical when we talk about communications. It's not enough to throw that out there. You have to talk about how you've achieved it. I always point out it's critical to communicate your strategy. How many times have you been a part of an organization where you've been going down a path and you've been doing something because that's what management told you to do, and then one day you're going down a path doing that and somebody says, oh, no, we changed that. Well, did you tell me? And I hear that from people all the time. It's the lack of communication, whether it's going, frankly, up or down. You could have somebody at a lower level who's come up with a new strategy to do something, and he's come up with something even better than the way they were doing it, but if he doesn't properly communicate it to those around him, if that person doesn't properly communicate to those above them or anybody who's involved in it, it's really not going to effectively work. If you're a leader in an organization and there's a new strategy, it's not enough even just to tell the strategy. You have to communicate the strategy in the sense that you have to talk about, how did we come up with this strategy? How is the strategy going to work? How are we effectively going to manage this strategy? If you just tell people, here's the new strategy, do you get any buy-in? No. You have to figure out a way to communicate this so that they actually buy into the strategy, that they believe that this is the best way to accomplish the task. And that's exactly what Brian Herta did that day. And I will tell you, listening to Brian Herta on the radio, he is amazing. He's got a wonderful, calm voice. He would exactly talk to his rookie driver and let him know, this is what you need to get through this race. And we think it's going to be the winning strategy. So when you communicate that strategy, when everybody knows what the strategy is and what you're trying to achieve, and that's the other thing. Everybody on that pit stand had to buy. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody originally believed it, but they had to talk it over. And as a group, came up with a consensus about how they were going to do this. And if somebody had something they were going to disagree with, going back to the culture of communication, they had the ability to say, this is why I don't think it's going to work. But as they talked through it, they ultimately came up, and as they strategized out loud, they ultimately came up with their strategy. They sent Alexander Rossi back out into the race. And they're telling him this ridiculous fuel number. And an amazing thing happened. He began to figure out ways to get better mileage. There were other team cars. Remember I told you they partnered up with the Andretti racing team? I was actually able to move behind them and kind of draft them for a while and save fuel. And then something even more amazing happened. Because originally he was only getting about 4.2 miles to the gallon. He figured out a way to do better than the number they were telling him. Now, if Alexander Rossi was standing here today, if he was standing in front of this group and you raised your hand and said, what did you do that day to get the extra mileage? You know what he would say? I'm not going to tell you. He figured out a secret that day, and he's pointed out he's going to use it again someday when he needs to. So he's not telling anybody what that... So while there's a lot of communication, that's one thing I can tell you he has not communicated. But the most important thing was the combination of the team working together, communicating, coming up with a strategy, talking the strategy through, Brian Herta coaching his rookie driver. Suddenly they put themselves in a situation to potentially win this race. I should say there's one other player in this story, and that's this gentleman right here. His name is Carlos Munoz. Carlos Munoz was also 24 last year, same age as Alexander Rossi. Carlos Munoz, young race car driver, had been racing at Indy for a number of years. His very first Indy 500, he finished second. He is a great race car driver. And he knows, with 36 laps to go, he's in the driver's seat. He is the fastest car out there. He knows he's going to win the race. Just one minor problem. He has to make one last pit stop. But of course he knows, or at least he believes, everybody's going to have to make one last pit stop to pull this off. So he's out there running as fast as he can. Slowly but surely, all of the teams, all of the cars, late in the race, begin to pull in and do their pit stops. Lap 193, a car would come in. Lap 194, a car would come in. Slowly but surely, each one of the lead cars begins to pull in. Finally, on lap 196, Carlos Munoz from Colombia is leading the race, and in second place is Brian Herta. Brian Herta's team, Alexander Rossi. Alexander Rossi's out there. Carlos Munoz on lap 196 decides, well, it's time. I've got to come in and do that pit stop, get what we call a splash of fuel, and go back out. Now remember, it takes 40 seconds for him to do that. And even though he's got a good lead over Alexander Rossi, it's not quite enough at this point in time. Now, Alexander Rossi, at this point, we have 4 laps to go. He has been saving fuel at an incredible pace. One of my jobs, as I said, in the pits, is to go up and ask people questions when things are really good or when things are really bad. I went up to Brian Hurd at that moment with just a few laps to go, and I asked Brian, I said, Brian, is your guy going to be able to go the distance? And Brian held up his hand like this and went, kind of a shaky thumbs up, meaning I think he's going to make it. Now, I will tell you, at various points in their fuel strategy, they thought he was going to run out of fuel with 2 laps to go. So they weren't 100%. They were all in on that strategy. And I'll tell you, that's another really important thing. When you have a strategy, at some point you have to buy into it. If you've got 3 or 4 strategies working at once, you're not going to pull it off. And I've seen that happen at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway before as well. Now, it's really important to talk about how the lap works. We call it oval racing. In essence, it's an oval, but it's kind of a rectangle is a better way to describe it. 2.5 miles around. They call it turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, and turn 4. Technically, an oval would have no turns, but that's the way we refer to it. So let's get to the very last lap. Alexander Rossi has been desperately saving fuel the entire time. As he starts this last lap, he is leading the race. He has about a 20-second lead over Carlos Munoz. But he has just barely more than half a gallon of fuel in his tank. 0.65 of a gallon to be exact. And that's not a lot of fuel for 1 lap at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. He starts this lap. Carlos Munoz is going 220 miles an hour, desperately chasing him down. You know how fast Alexander Rossi's going at this point, trying to save fuel? 180 miles an hour. Just enough to keep going. He goes through turn 1, car's fully under power, and once again, they're telling him, keep going. Just keep saving fuel, go fast as you can, but save fuel. He goes through turn 1, engine still running. They figure so far, so good. They get through what they call turn 2. And as they get through turn 2, they realize he's going to run out of fuel before this lap is over. He's not going to be able to go all the way. So as he exits turn 2 and gets onto that back straightaway, they tell him, and once again, this is the team working together with it, and they had to come up with this in a heartbeat practically. They said, the last thing we want you to do is floor it. Because if you're going to run out of fuel, use that last little burst of fuel to give yourself some acceleration. So he floors it on the back straightaway, goes through turn 3. As he exits turn 3 and gets between turn 3 and turn 4, he runs out of fuel. He runs out of fuel as he enters turn 4. But there's an amazing thing. When you're going 180 miles an hour, you'd be amazed how far you can coast. Alexander Rossi coasted across the finish line in first place. He won the race. Carlos Munoz, 5 seconds back. He had closed 15 seconds that lap. And I got to tell you, in Indianapolis Motor Speedway, that's amazing to be able to do that. I will also tell you that when Alexander Rossi crossed the finish line that day, barely more than 130 miles an hour. Once again, he was just coasting. Now, as I said, my job is to talk to people when things are going really good or really bad. And in this case, things were going really good. Except my clicker's not. Team celebrating, as you might imagine.
Brian Hurd, you won with Dan Weldon this way a few years ago. Now you've come back with Alexander Rossi. You've taken a rookie to the win here at the Indy 500. How did you do it?
You know, everything has to go right here. You know, I want to thank DW and, you know, the time we had here in 2011. This is unbelievable. You know, I think all sponsors, Nap Auto Parts, Castrol, everybody came on board. But man, it was so close at the end. And for a rookie to drive with the poise he did, it's such a tough situation. I mean, I was telling him, don't let anybody pass you, but save fuel, and he did it. And we won again. All tribute to Alex, Michael Andretti, the whole team. I mean, we worked so well together this month, and I was hoping one of us would win, and I was hoping to be us. And, hey man, it did.
You're on your way to victory circle.
By the way, the car didn't make it, did it? I I mean, when I say he ran out of gas, he ran out of fuel. He did not make it a run. The good news is they tow him in, and he gets to stand in victory circle, and he gets to hold the wreath and have the picture taken, and he gets to win the race that day. And I always go back to just making the really simple point that all it took was communications. All it took to win the Indianapolis 500, the greatest spectacle in racing, was communications after 2 setbacks and all these other problems they had during the course of the day. But it was the communications that pulled it off that particular day. Now, I want to go back over and talk about some of these concepts again, because I cannot stress enough the whole concept of communications culture. If you don't have a communications culture, if people don't feel that they can talk about things, then you've got a problem. If they don't feel they can talk up the chain, you've got a problem. If they don't feel they can talk down the chain, they've got a problem. If they don't feel they can talk with their peers, that they've got a problem. And obviously the communications culture is critical in the way you do that. I mean, it's got to be people who know that if they come up with an idea, nobody's going to shout them down, nobody's going to tell them that they've gone in the wrong direction. When you look at the growth mindset, which I know you're going to be talking about today, it deals an awful lot with collaboration. Collaboration is critical, and if you don't have a communications culture, you will not have a collaborative environment. I can tell you right now, it's just not going to work. Strategize out loud. Actually, I want to tell you a great story about something that happened in a hospital. It actually happened about 20 years ago in a hospital in London, and they were having a problem with mortality rates they were doing child heart operations for kids, and they were having a problem in the handoff between surgery and ICU. When they were taking him out of surgery and into ICU, first off, they realized their mortality rate was higher than they wanted. When they began to break it down, they realized that the actual problem itself was in the handoff. But they still didn't, even though they knew where the problem was, they didn't seem to be able to figure out how to solve that problem. So one of the doctors who was associated with this particular program is, sitting there one day in the hospital trying to come up with a new idea of how to solve this problem, and he was watching television, and that day there just happened to be a Formula One race on television. And he's watching the Formula One race, and he watched a pit stop, and he realized that, that's exactly what we do. It's in essence a pit stop where all this sort of organized chaos happens in a moment, and then it goes back out, and we have to go to the new thing. That doctor called the Ferrari Formula One team in Italy and said, I need to talk to the guy who's responsible for your pit stops. They actually started a communication. Two doctors actually flew down to Italy and communicated, and they talked together about how they were what ideas they had. And the interesting story is that the guys who ran the Ferrari Formula One team